Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Nathan, and I've been driving cab in Portland, Oregon for over 12 years now. In this line of work, you see all kinds of people and situations, not all of them pleasant. Portland isn't exactly the safest city to be cruising around at night, but I've got bills to pay and a family to support. This particular story happened about 3 years ago, and it's something that still keeps me up at night sometimes. It was early December, around 6 in the evening, but the storm clouds were so thick it felt more like 9 or 10 at night. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of Oregon downpour that makes you question why anyone chooses to live in the Pacific Northwest. I was circling downtown, looking for fares, when I spotted a woman flagging me down near Pioneer Courthouse Square. As I pulled over, I noticed she wasn't alone. There was a little girl with her, maybe 4 or 5 years old, staying close to the woman's side. The woman was wearing a long black coat and dark sunglasses, which struck me as odd given how overcast it was. But hey, people wear weird things for all sorts of reasons, so I didn't think much of it at first. They got in, and the woman gave me an address in southeast Portland, way out past Powell Boulevard. It was going to be a decent fare, especially in this weather. I pulled away from the curb and started making my way through the storm. About 10 minutes into the drive, the woman started crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that I could see in the rearview mirror. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't respond. Sometimes passengers are dealing with personal stuff, and the last thing they need is a chatty cabbie making it worse. So I left her alone. The rain was getting heavier, and thunder was starting to rumble overhead. That's when the woman said something that confused me. She's always been terrified of storms like this. The thunder especially. That's why I have to be with her whenever the weather gets bad like this. She can sense when I'm scared for her. I glanced in the mirror again. The little girl was sitting perfectly still, staring out the window. She wasn't crying or showing any signs of fear that I could see. In fact, she hadn't made a sound since they'd gotten in the car. I figured maybe she was just one of those quiet kids. Or maybe she was too scared to say anything. Yeah, thunderstorms can be pretty frightening for little ones, I said, trying to be supportive. The woman didn't respond, just kept making those soft, sighing sounds that people make when they're trying to stop crying. We were almost to their destination when the woman suddenly cursed under her breath and asked me to change course. She wanted me to take them to Lone Fir Cemetery instead. Said she'd forgotten something there and needed to retrieve it before they closed the gates. She promised to pay extra for the detour. I'd driven past Lone Fir plenty of times, but never had a reason to go inside. It's one of Portland's oldest cemeteries, dating back to the 1800s. The whole place has always given me the creeps, especially on a dark, stormy evening like this one. Are you sure your phone will still be there? I asked as we pulled up to the cemetery entrance. You know how people are, they take things that don't belong to them. It'll be there, she said with complete certainty. It's locked in my daughter's mausoleum. No one else has access. That hit me like a punch to the gut. This woman had a daughter buried in that cemetery, and here I was complaining about having to make a quick stop. I felt like a complete jerk. "Don't worry about it," I told her. "We'll get there in time." She jumped out of the car as soon as I parked, running toward the cemetery gates to make it before closing time. She called back that she'd only be a few minutes and asked me to wait. I turned around to check on the little girl, figuring she'd be scared being left alone in a stranger's car. But there was no one in the back seat. I blinked hard and looked again, but the seat was completely empty. My mind started racing. I was sure I'd seen a child get into the car with the woman. I remembered her distinctly, brown hair with bangs, maybe 4 years old, wearing a small winter coat. But she was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't gotten out with the woman. I would have noticed that. When the woman returned, about 15 minutes later, I was still trying to figure out what had happened. "Where's your daughter?" I asked, probably sounding more alarmed than I meant to. She looked at me with complete confusion. "I came alone. I don't know what you're talking about." "No, there was definitely a little girl with you when you got in. Brown hair, about 4 years old. She was sitting right next to you." The woman's face went white, and she started crying again, but these weren't the quiet tears from before. She was sobbing now, and she looked angry. "That's not funny," she said. "Why would you joke about something like that? I'm not joking. I swear I saw a little girl get in this car with you." She stared at me for a long moment, and then her expression changed. The anger faded, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "The girl you're describing," she said slowly. "Brown hair with bangs, about 4 years old. That's my daughter Denise. She's buried in this cemetery. I come here every time there's a bad storm because she was so afraid of thunder and lightning." I didn't know what to say. I felt terrible for bringing up something so painful, but I also couldn't deny what I'd seen. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to upset you. I really did see someone." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I believe you. How else would you know what she looked like? I never showed you a picture or described her." The ride back to her house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The woman cried quietly the whole way, but she kept saying things like, "She's here with me," and she came along to make sure I was safe in the storm. I dropped her off and drove straight home, even though I usually worked much later than that. I needed to see my own kids, needed to hold them and remind myself that some families get to stay together. Ever since that night, I've had more experiences like that one. It's like seeing Denise open some kind of door, and now I occasionally pick up passengers who aren't exactly among the living. I still don't understand why it happens or what it means, but I've learned to accept it as part of the job. Sometimes the living aren't the only ones who need a ride. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Samuel Silva, and I only worked as a cab driver for a brief period in my life. My father had been doing it for over 30 years when he got sick and asked me to take over his evening shifts while I was finishing up my business degree at the University of Chicago. I was 22 at the time and honestly wasn't thrilled about the idea. I've always been pretty introverted, and the thought of making small talk with strangers all night was my idea of torture. But my dad needed help, and family comes first. So every day after my last class at 4, I'd grab something to eat, change clothes, and be out on the road by 5:30. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than any other part-time job I could have found, and it helped keep my family afloat during a difficult time. One Tuesday afternoon in late October, I picked up an elderly woman outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She was probably in her 70s, well-dressed in a navy blue coat and carrying a small leather purse. She asked me to take her to Morrison Funeral Home on the north side, which was about a 15-minute drive from where we were. The ride was pleasant enough. She was polite but quiet, thanking me when I helped her into the car and confirming the address when I repeated it back to her. Some passengers want to chat your ear off, others prefer silence. She seemed like the latter type, so I just focused on driving and let her be. When we arrived at the funeral home, she paid me exactly what was on the meter, thanked me again, and headed inside. I was about to pull away when I noticed she'd left her purse on the back seat. It was a small black leather bag, the kind my grandmother used to carry. I couldn't just drive off with someone's purse, especially an elderly woman's. God knows what important things she might have in there: medication, identification, money for getting home. So I parked the car and went inside to find her. The funeral home was busier than I'd expected. There were a lot of people milling around, and it took me a few minutes to spot my passenger. She was standing near the front of the main viewing room, next to a large floral arrangement. I made my way through the crowd, trying to be as respectful as possible given the somber atmosphere. As I got closer, I could see the deceased clearly for the first time. It was an elderly man, probably around 80, wearing an elegant black suit and tie. There was a photograph next to the casket showing him in his younger days, wearing what looked like the same style of clothing. He'd apparently been a sharp dresser his whole life. I approached the woman and quietly explained that she'd forgotten her purse in my cab. She was so grateful that she tried to give me a tip, but I declined. Losing her purse would have been a real hassle for her, and I was just glad I could return it before she'd even realized it was missing. I left the funeral home and continued working for another few hours. Around 8:30, I was driving past a shopping mall when a young guy flagged me down. But as I pulled over, he stepped back and held up his hands apologetically. "Sorry, man," he said. "I didn't realize you already had a passenger." I looked in my rear-view mirror, confused. "I don't have anyone back there. The car's empty." The guy walked closer and peered into my back seat, then looked at me like I was crazy. "Dude, I swear I just saw an old man sitting back there, wearing a black suit and one of those old-fashioned hats. He was looking right at me." I turned around to look at the back seat myself, even though I knew it was empty. "Are you sure? Maybe the streetlight was playing tricks on your eyes or something." "No way," he insisted. I got a really clear look at him. Old guy, definitely wearing a suit and hat. Looked like he stepped out of an old movie or something. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was describing exactly what the deceased man at the funeral home had been wearing, both in death and in the photograph from his younger days. There was no way this stranger could have known that unless he'd actually seen something. The young man decided he didn't want to get in my cab after all, which I completely understood. I wouldn't have wanted to ride with a ghost either. I spent the rest of the drive home checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, but I never saw anything unusual. When I got home, I immediately called my mother and told her what had happened. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, she suggested I call it a night and come home immediately. She said my father agreed that some things were more important than making a few extra bucks. I never had another paranormal experience while driving cab, but that one was enough to last me a lifetime. I finished helping my dad until he recovered, and then I gratefully went back to my normal life of textbooks and term papers. I still don't know why that man chose to take one last ride in my cab, or what he was trying to accomplish. Maybe he just wanted to say goodbye to the world he was leaving behind. Maybe he had unfinished business he needed to take care of. Or maybe, in those first moments after death, some part of him wasn't ready to accept that his time on earth was over. All I know is that for a brief time, I shared my cab with someone who had already taken his final journey, and somehow, that doesn't frighten me as much as it probably should. We all have to go somewhere when our time is up. I guess some people just need a ride to get there. My name is Stephen, and this story is about my father, also named Stephen. He gave me permission to share this, though it took him years to feel comfortable talking about it at all. When this happened about 12 years ago, I was still in high school, and my parents decided not to tell my sister and me about it until we were older. They thought we were too young to handle something this disturbing. My dad had been driving cab in Milwaukee for most of his adult life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave him flexible hours to help my mom run the small restaurant they owned together. Every night, he'd finish his day shift at the restaurant, then head out in the cab to earn some extra money during the evening rush. The restaurant was attached to our house, so my dad could usually grab dinner with the family before starting his cab shifts. But on busy nights, especially during summer tourist season, he'd sometimes work straight through until almost midnight. The more hours he put in, the more money he made, and with 2 kids to put through college, every dollar counted. It was a Tuesday night in late July when this happened. Dad had just dropped off a family at Mitchell International Airport. They'd been visiting from out of state and needed a ride to catch their flight back to Denver. The airport is about 20 minutes outside the city, and the drive back takes you through some pretty isolated stretches of highway. Dad was heading back toward downtown when he saw 2 young men standing on the shoulder of the road, trying to flag down passing cars. They had a large black suitcase with them and a smaller backpack. It wasn't the safest area to be stranded, especially at night. So despite his usual policy of being cautious about picking up strangers on the highway, Dad pulled over. One of the guys immediately asked if he could pop the trunk to put their suitcase in the back. Dad said sure and was about to get out to help them load it, like he always did when passengers had heavy luggage. But both men quickly told him not to worry about it, that they could handle it themselves. That should have been his first red flag. But Dad was tired and just wanted to get them wherever they were going so he could head home. They said they'd had a fight with a friend who was supposed to give them a ride to the airport, and he'd left them stranded on the highway. Their flight was leaving in less than 2 hours, and they were desperate to get there in time. The trip to the airport took about 18 minutes. When they arrived, Dad pulled into the taxi zone and popped the trunk so they could get their luggage. He heard them moving around back there for a minute. Then the trunk slammed shut, and they were waving goodbye through the rear window as they hurried toward the terminal. Dad drove straight home after that. He had to be up early the next morning to help my mom prep for the breakfast rush at the restaurant, and he was exhausted. He parked the cab in our driveway, locked it up, and went inside to get some sleep. The next morning, both my parents were up at 5 a.m. to get the restaurant ready for opening. But as soon as they stepped outside, they were hit with the most horrible smell either of them had ever encountered. It was coming from the cab. At first, Mom thought maybe a cat had crawled under the car and died, or that Dad had run over something the night before, and pieces of it were stuck somewhere on the undercarriage. But when they followed the smell to its source, it led them directly to the trunk. Dad opened it up and immediately started retching. Inside was the same black suitcase the two men had put there the night before. The smell was so overwhelming that Mom had to go back inside the house while Dad called the police. When the officers arrived, they opened the suitcase and found the body of a young woman who had obviously been dead for several days. The coroner later determined she'd been murdered and stuffed into that suitcase at least 72 hours before Dad picked up those two men. The investigation moved quickly once they identified the victim. Her family had reported her missing 5 days earlier, and they were certain her ex-boyfriend and his best friend were responsible. Those were the two men Dad had given a ride to the airport, and by the time police tracked them down, they'd already fled the country. They were eventually caught and extradited back to the United States, but that's not the end of the story. The worst part, at least for my family, was what happened afterward. Dad tried to go back to driving cab a few days later, but passengers kept complaining about hearing sounds coming from the trunk. Knocking noises, like someone was trapped back there trying to get out. Dad would pull over and check, but the trunk was always empty. It got so bad that people were demanding to be let out before completing their trips. Word started getting around among other drivers that something was wrong with Dad's cab, and his business began to suffer. He was losing money every night because passengers were too scared to ride with him. That's when my little sister started talking about the lady who came to her window every night. Her bedroom faced our driveway, where Dad parked the cab, and she kept telling my parents that a sad woman stood outside looking in at her. My sister was only 10 at the time, and my parents initially thought she was just having nightmares or looking for attention. But then Dad started hearing crying coming from the trunk while he was driving. Not passengers crying, this was coming from behind him, from the empty trunk. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded heartbroken. The final straw came when Dad was driving alone late one night and heard a voice clearly say, "Please take me home." He pulled over immediately and called my mom, telling her he was done with the cab business. They sold that car within a week and bought a different one. Dad went back to working only at the restaurant, and gradually things returned to normal. My sister stopped seeing the woman at her window, and our house felt peaceful again. But for months afterward, Dad would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he could still hear that woman crying. He went to counseling for a while to help deal with the trauma of unknowingly transporting a murder victim, and eventually he was able to move past it. The young woman's killer and his accomplice were both sentenced to life in prison. Her family was finally able to bury her and have some closure. And my dad learned that sometimes, when someone dies violently and far from home, their spirit doesn't rest until they're properly laid to rest. I think she was just trying to get back to her family, and Dad's cab was the only way she knew how to get there. Once her body was found and returned to her loved ones, she was finally able to let go and move on. But it's a hell of a thing to discover that you've been sharing your car with a ghost, especially one who died so tragically. Dad still drives, but never professionally, and he always checks his trunk twice before going anywhere. This happened to me about 7 years ago when I was driving cab in San Antonio, Texas. I'd been doing it for several years at that point, working the 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. shift most nights. It was decent money, especially on weekends when people were going out to bars and clubs in the downtown area. One particular evening, I picked up an older woman on the east side of town. She looked to be in her 60s, well-dressed, but carrying this enormous black duffel bag that seemed way too heavy for someone her age. She struggled to get it into the back seat, and I offered to help, but she insisted she could manage it herself. She wanted to go to the city center, which was about a 20-minute drive. The whole trip, she kept glancing at that bag like she was nervous about something. I figured maybe it contained something valuable. Or perhaps she was just one of those people who didn't like strangers handling their belongings. When we got to her destination, she paid me and got out, but she left the bag behind. I called after her, but she was already disappearing into the crowd of people walking around downtown. It was a Friday night, so the area was pretty busy with folks heading to restaurants and clubs. I figured she'd realize she'd forgotten it and come back, so I waited a few minutes. When she didn't return, I decided to take the bag with me and try to find some identification inside so I could return it to her. I had her drop-off address, so worst case scenario, I could drive back there and see if she was home. But first, I had to pick up another passenger, a college kid who was trying to get back to his apartment near the University of Texas at San Antonio. When he got in, he had to push the bag over to make room for himself. "What's in there?" he asked. "Feels like it weighs a ton." "A passenger left it behind," I explained. "I'm trying to figure out how to get it back to her." After I dropped the kid off, I pulled over in a well-lit parking lot to examine the bag more closely. The outside pockets were empty, and I didn't want to completely invade the woman's privacy by opening the main compartment, but I needed to find some way to identify her. Finally, I unzipped the bag and immediately jumped back in surprise. The first thing I saw was a hand sticking out, and for a split second, I thought it was a real human hand. My heart nearly stopped before I realized it was plastic. Looking more carefully, I could see that the bag contained the disassembled parts of a store mannequin. Arms, legs, torso, and head, all packed separately. It seemed like an odd thing for someone to be carrying around, but I figured maybe she worked in retail or was helping someone set up a display. I zipped the bag back up and drove home. It was late, I was tired, and I decided I'd try to return it to the woman the next day. I lived alone at the time in a small house with a detached garage, so I pulled the cab inside and locked everything up before going to bed. The next morning, I was getting ready to start my shift when I went out to the garage to get the car. What I saw there made me question my own sanity. The mannequin was fully assembled, and sitting upright in the back seat of my cab, positioned like a passenger waiting for a ride. Its plastic face had this unsettling smile molded into it, and its glass eyes seemed to be staring directly at me through the rear window. I stood there for at least 5 minutes, trying to figure out how this could have happened. My garage was locked, my car was locked, and I was the only person with keys to either. There was no way someone could have gotten inside to assemble that mannequin. But there it was, sitting in my back seat like it belonged there. I forced myself to get closer to the car, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the parts had shifted around during the night and somehow fallen together in a way that made it look assembled. But when I examined it more closely, I could see that all the joints were properly connected. Someone or something had deliberately put this thing together. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The mannequin's head was turned slightly to the left, facing the window on the driver's side. I was certain it had been looking straight ahead when I first saw it. I got in the car, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched from behind. My plan was to drive straight to the address where I dropped off the woman and give her back her mannequin, whether she wanted it or not. I wasn't keeping that thing in my car for another day. But as I was driving, I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror. The mannequin's head had moved again. Now it was facing forward, but I could swear I'd seen it turn just as I looked in the mirror. Its plastic eyes seemed to be focused on the back of my head. I pulled over at the next red light and turned around to look directly at the thing. It was staring right at me with that horrible, frozen smile. I blinked hard and looked again, convinced I had to be imagining things, but its position hadn't changed. "This is impossible," I said out loud, which felt stupid. But I needed to hear my own voice to ground myself in reality. The light turned green, and I continued driving, but I kept the rearview mirror angled away from the back seat. I didn't want to see that thing move again. When I got to the woman's neighborhood, I found her walking down the sidewalk like she was heading somewhere. I pulled over and called out to her. At first, she didn't recognize me, but when I explained who I was and that she'd left something in my cab, her expression changed completely. She looked embarrassed and maybe a little scared. "I was hoping you wouldn't bring it back," she said quietly. "Why, what is it?" She glanced around nervously, then walked closer to my car so she wouldn't have to speak loudly. "My daughter lost her husband last year to cancer," she explained. She was so devastated that she took that mannequin to someone who does things that aren't natural. She wanted her husband's spirit to inhabit it so she could still have him around. I felt cold all over. What kind of person does something like that? "The kind you shouldn't get involved with," the woman said. But my daughter was desperate. After the ritual, terrible things started happening in her house. Things moving on their own, voices in the middle of the night, cold spots that wouldn't go away. That wasn't her husband in that mannequin. It was something else, something evil. "So why did you have it?" "I took it from her house to protect her, but I didn't know what to do with it. I thought if I left it somewhere far from home, maybe whatever was attached to it would stay there and leave my family alone. I was angry that she deliberately left this thing in my car, but I was also terrified. "Well, you need to take it back right now. I'm not keeping it." She reluctantly agreed, and I got out to help her remove the mannequin from my back seat. But when I opened the rear door, the thing's arm moved slightly, like it was trying to resist being taken out of the car. The woman saw it too and stepped back. "It doesn't want to leave," she whispered. "I don't care what it wants," I said, grabbing the mannequin by its shoulders and pulling it out of the car. Its head turned to follow my movement, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw something behind those glass eyes that wasn't just reflected light. I set it down on the sidewalk and got back in my car as quickly as possible. The woman was already backing away from it, looking terrified. "What are you going to do with it now?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe find a priest or someone who knows how to handle these things properly." I drove away without looking back. I never found out what happened to that woman or her daughter, but I spent the rest of that day having my car blessed by a priest at the local Catholic church. Call it superstition, but I wasn't taking any chances. I also had the back seat thoroughly cleaned and checked for any signs that something unnatural had been sitting there. The cleaning crew found some kind of residue on the seat that they couldn't identify, but they managed to remove it. For weeks afterward, I was nervous every time I had to pick up passengers, especially at night. I kept expecting to see that mannequin again, sitting in my back seat with its horrible smile and those dead glass eyes. But nothing like that ever happened again, and eventually I was able to put the whole experience behind me. I still drive cab, but I'm a lot more careful about what passengers leave in my car, and I always check the back seat thoroughly before starting a new shift. Some things are better left alone, and playing with forces you don't understand can open doors that should stay closed forever. Back in 2012, I was working as a cab driver in Phoenix, Arizona. I'd been doing this job for about 8 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen everything. Every day, I'd leave the house before dawn and wouldn't return until well past midnight. The longer I stayed out there, the more money I'd make. That was the simple math of survival. That particular evening started off wrong from the moment I woke up. There was this heavy feeling in my chest, like when you know bad news is coming, but you don't know what form it'll take. My wife always said I had good instincts, maybe too good for my own peace of mind. I kept telling myself it was just another day, just another shift. But that gnawing sensation in my gut wouldn't leave me alone. The night dragged on slower than usual. Fewer passengers, longer waits between fares. By 10:30, I was seriously considering calling it quits early, which wasn't like me at all. I was heading back toward the central part of the city when I saw him. A man standing on the sidewalk outside a 24-hour diner, arm raised to flag me down. Something about the whole scene felt off. The way he stood so perfectly still, like he'd been waiting there for hours. The diner behind him was lit up, but I couldn't see any other customers inside. The parking lot was empty, except for one old pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in days. I almost drove past him. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to keep going, to pretend I hadn't seen his signal. But then I thought about the guy standing out there alone and how dangerous Phoenix could be for someone stranded at night. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He got in without saying a word, just slid into the back seat like he belonged there. I asked him where he was headed, keeping my eyes on the road like I always did. I wasn't one for small talk with passengers, just get them where they need to go and move on to the next fare. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. "Desert View," he said, naming a remote area about 45 minutes outside the city limits. It wasn't even really a neighborhood, just scattered mobile homes and abandoned lots where people went when they wanted to disappear from the world. My heart sank. That was exactly the kind of isolated location I tried to avoid, especially this late at night. But the guy was already in my cab, the meter was running, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him to get out and find another ride. The feeling of dread that had been following me all day intensified as I merged onto the highway leading out of town. The desert highway was completely empty. No other headlights in either direction, just endless stretches of scrubland disappearing into darkness. My passenger hadn't said another word since giving me the destination. The silence was so complete that I started to wonder if he'd fallen asleep back there. But something told me he was wide awake, watching. 20 minutes into the drive, we took the exit for Desert View. The paved road quickly turned to gravel, then to dirt. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating nothing but cacti and tumbleweeds. The GPS on my phone had lost signal miles back. That's when he spoke again. "Turn left here." I looked around. There was no road to the left, just open desert stretching toward some distant mountains. "I'm sorry, but there's nowhere to turn. Are you sure this is right?" "Please," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my blood run cold. "Just turn left." For the first time since he'd gotten in, I looked at him in the rearview mirror. I needed to see his face, to understand what kind of person would ask me to drive into the middle of nowhere with no road to follow. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded sideways on the loose dirt. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it over the engine. I twisted around to look directly at the back seat. No tricks of mirrors or shadows this time. Nothing, nobody. The doors were still locked. The windows were up. There was no way anyone could have gotten out of that car without me knowing, especially not while we were driving. But the back seat was as empty as if no one had ever been there at all. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the stress of the job was finally getting to me. But I knew what I'd experienced. Someone had gotten into my cab. Someone had given me directions. Someone had asked me to turn left into the desert. I turned the car around and drove back to the city faster than I'd ever driven in my life, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally made it home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the front door. I told my wife everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just held me while I tried to stop trembling. I also called my buddy Marcus, another cabbie who'd been working the night shift for even longer than me. He'd called earlier asking why I wasn't on the radio, and I figured he deserved to know why I wouldn't be back out there for a while. 3 weeks passed before I felt ready to drive again. I needed the money too badly to stay off the road any longer. But I was nervous as hell that first night back, jumping at every shadow, questioning every passenger who flagged me down. It was Marcus who told me what I'd been dreading to hear. We were having lunch at our usual spot downtown when he got serious and said he had something important to tell me. Something his contact at the sheriff's department had shared with him, strictly off the record. "You remember that night you told me about, When you picked up that guy who wanted to go to Desert View. I nodded, my appetite suddenly gone. Well, they found something out there last week, right around where you said this happened. Marcus paused, like he was trying to figure out how to say the next part. They found bodies, man, a lot of them, mass graves that had been there for years. The blood drained from my face. I knew immediately what Marcus was going to say next, but I had to hear it anyway. The thing is, these weren't recent. The coroner said some of those remains had been there for at least a decade, maybe longer. Dozens of people who just vanished over the years. Missing persons cases that never got solved. I couldn't speak. I just sat there staring at my untouched sandwich while Marcus continued. I think maybe that guy in your cab wasn't trying to hurt you. Maybe he was trying to help. Maybe he wanted someone to find what was out there, so those families could finally have some answers. When I finally found my voice, it came out as barely a whisper. What if I hadn't stopped that night? What if I'd just driven past him? Marcus shrugged. Then maybe those people would still be out there in the desert, and nobody would ever know what happened to them. I never found out who my passenger was that night, or how long he'd been waiting by that diner for the right person to come along. But I like to think that wherever he is now, he's finally at peace, knowing that the forgotten dead have been found and can go home to their families at last. I still drive a cab, but I've never been back to Desert View. Some roads are better left untraveled, even when they lead to the truth. My name is David, and I've been driving a taxi for years. Back then, before ride-sharing apps existed, I had several regular clients who would call my cell phone directly when they needed a ride. So it didn't seem strange when my phone rang just past 4 in the morning. I answered with a tired voice, not much enthusiasm. Yellow cab. At first there was no response, just labored breathing, but before I could hang up, a young woman's voice broke the silence. Please, help me. I straightened up immediately. Her tone was anguished. It didn't sound like a prank or like someone who was drunk. She sounded terrified. Where are you? I asked right away. I don't know. I don't know where I am. They took me from my apartment. But... Her voice cut off, and a couple seconds later it came back, but now with a more desperate tone. Find my parents. Tell them to look for me here. She gave me an address in Queens, and then the call ended. The silence in the car felt heavy. I stared at the phone screen waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. For a few seconds I sat still, trying to think about what to do. The most sensible thing was to ignore it, continue with my route, but her voice had stuck with me. There was something about it that disturbed me too much. I started the engine and decided to go to the address she had given me. The drive felt strange. There was something in the air I couldn't explain, a feeling of discomfort, as if something was watching me. I wasn't afraid, but I felt a deep anguish, a desperation that wasn't mine. With each mile I advanced, the feeling became more intense, and that's when I understood. It wasn't my fear. It was hers. It was the terror of the woman who had called me. When I arrived, I saw a modest house with the lights off. I stayed in the car for a moment, not knowing if I should knock, but I couldn't leave without saying anything. I knocked on the door with some hesitation, and after a few seconds, a middle-aged woman opened it. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, as if she hadn't slept in days. I'm sorry for the hour, but I received a call from a young woman who asked me to look for her here. I said, without beating around the bush. Her expression changed immediately. "What did she say?" she asked urgently. "That they took her from her apartment, that she didn't know where she was." At that moment, a man appeared behind her. He stood there observing me in silence until the woman explained what I had just told her. They both looked at each other, and after a moment, the man spoke. "Our daughter disappeared 5 weeks ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did her voice sound like?" asked the woman with a thread of hope. "She sounded scared, like she was crying." The woman put her hands to her mouth, holding back tears. The man took a deep breath, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Where were you when she called?" I gave them the exact location, and both frowned. "That area is very far from where Jessica usually goes," said the man. "There are only empty lots and abandoned warehouses there." "We can go," I said without thinking. They remained silent for a few seconds, but then nodded. I went in my taxi, and they followed me to the location. When we got out of the cars, the atmosphere felt even heavier than before. The street was poorly lit. There was no one around, and honestly, it wasn't a nice place for a young woman to be. "This is where I received the call," I said, pointing to the spot. It looked like any ordinary place, but when the woman walked forward a bit, she stopped short and put a hand to her chest. "Look at that," whispered the man. A few meters away, in an empty lot with weeds, the ground appeared to have been recently disturbed. The man walked over there and began digging with his hands. I didn't know if I should help or walk away. The woman was trembling and murmuring something I couldn't understand. I could only watch, paralyzed. Then I saw something protruding from the dirt, a piece of purple fabric. The man continued digging with more desperation, clawing at the earth with his hands until he finally saw her, his daughter's body. The woman's scream shook my chest. She fell to her knees while the man stood motionless, with his hands dirty from soil and his face in shock. I couldn't breathe. It made no sense. She had called me minutes before, but seeing the condition of her body, you could tell she had been there much longer. The police arrived minutes later. While they questioned us, I looked at my cell phone expecting to find the number that had called me, but it didn't exist. I searched the call history over and over, but there was no record of the call. I sat in my taxi, my mind blank, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked at the parents, still embraced next to their daughter's body, crying in silence. The scene was devastating. I tried to reason through what I had experienced, to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. Before I left, the mother approached me with her eyes full of tears and her voice broken. "Thank you for coming. She just wanted to come home." I nodded, not knowing what to answer. That night, I understood that there are voices that, even after death, try to be heard, and that there are those who keep looking for the way back home, even though they no longer belong to this world. But what haunts me most is not just that she called me from beyond death. It's thinking about what she might have gone through in those final weeks. The fear, the hope that someone would find her, the desperate attempts to reach out for help. And somehow, even in death, her need to be found was so strong that it broke through whatever barrier separates the living from the dead. I've driven thousands of people over the years, but Jessica's call was different. It wasn't just a ride request. It was a final plea from someone who refused to disappear without a trace. She couldn't rest until someone led her parents to the truth, until they knew what happened to her. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there, lost souls trying to make that one last call, hoping someone will answer and help them find their way home. And every time my phone rings in the early morning hours, for just a split second, I hold my breath and wonder if it might be another voice from beyond, asking for help I'm not sure I'm brave enough to give again. I'm not comfortable sharing my real name, but I'll tell you this story because it needs to be told. I worked as a taxi driver in Phoenix, Arizona for nearly 20 years, and in that time, I've had all kinds of experiences, some good, some bad, and some that still make me question what I know about life and death. This particular incident happened about 5 years ago, and it's the reason I ended up in therapy. It's also why I eventually sold my cab and found a different line of work. I used to work the late shift, from around 8 p.m. until 6 in the morning. The money was decent during those hours. You'd get airport runs, people leaving clubs, emergency trips to hospitals. Phoenix never really sleeps, especially in the winter months when all the snowbirds come down from up north. It was a Wednesday night in February, just past midnight, when I was dropping off a couple at a hotel near Sky Harbor Airport. As I was putting their payment into my cash box, I noticed a man approaching my cab. He was tall and heavyset, probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a worn-out flannel shirt. He looked tired, maybe a little stressed, but nothing that set off any alarm bells. "You available?" he asked. "Sure, where are you headed?" "Just give me 1 minute," he said. "I need to get my mom, she's right over there." I nodded and waited. A couple of minutes later, I saw him walking back, carrying an elderly woman in his arms. She appeared to be sleeping, her head resting against his shoulder, eyes closed. I assumed she was probably ill or just very frail. It's not uncommon to transport elderly people who can't walk on their own. I got out to open the back door for them. The man carefully placed the woman on the seat, then climbed in beside her. She remained in the same position, leaning against him, completely still. "Where to?" I asked as I got back behind the wheel. "Scottsdale," he said, giving me an address. "It's my aunt's house, my mom's sister. She's been taking care of her." I didn't ask why he felt the need to explain the family connection, but people often share more information than necessary when they're nervous or upset. I started driving toward Scottsdale. About 15 minutes into the trip, the man asked if we could stop at a 24-hour pharmacy. "My mom needs her medication," he explained. "I forgot to pick it up earlier." "No problem," I said. "The meter will keep running, though." "That's fine, I won't be long." I pulled into a CVS parking lot. The man got out, leaving his mother sleeping in the backseat. I watched him disappear into the store and settled in to wait. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. I was getting concerned not just about the time, but about the elderly woman in my backseat. She hadn't moved at all since getting in the car, and I was starting to worry about her health. After about 25 minutes, I decided to check on him. But just as I was about to get out of the car, the woman spoke. "He's not coming back." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear. I turned around to look at her, but her eyes were still closed, her head still resting in the same position. "Ma'am," I said, but she had gone silent again, appearing to sleep just as before. I waited another few minutes, then got out and went into the pharmacy to look for her son. I searched every aisle, checked the prescription counter, even asked the cashier. A young woman at the register said she remembered seeing a man matching his description, but that he'd left through the side exit at least 20 minutes ago. I couldn't believe it. He'd abandoned his own mother in my cab. I went back to the car and tried to wake the woman gently. Ma'am, we need to talk," but she didn't respond. I tried again, a little louder this time, but nothing. I was starting to panic. What if she was seriously ill? I drove straight to the nearest police station. 2 officers came out to the parking lot with me, and when one of them checked the woman's pulse, his expression changed immediately. "Sir, this woman is deceased," he said quietly. I felt like the world had tilted off its axis. "That's impossible," I said. "She spoke to me less than an hour ago. She told me he wasn't coming back." Both officers looked at me strangely. One of them asked me to repeat what I'd just said. "She said he's not coming back while he was in the pharmacy," I explained. I heard her clearly. The officers exchanged a look that I didn't understand at the time. "Sir," one of them said carefully, "according to the preliminary examination, this woman has been dead for several hours, possibly since early this evening." I insisted they were wrong. I was absolutely certain that the woman had spoken to me. But when the medical examiner arrived and did a more thorough assessment, they confirmed what the officers had said. The woman had been dead for at least 6 hours, probably longer. They kept me at the station most of the night, taking my statement over and over again. I told them everything, where I'd picked up the man and woman, the stop at the pharmacy, his disappearance, and what the woman had said to me. By morning, they'd located the man. It turned out he was indeed the woman's son, but he had serious mental health issues. His mother had died of natural causes earlier that evening at their apartment, and he'd panicked. He didn't know what to do with her body, so he'd carried her to my cab, and then fled when the reality of the situation overwhelmed him. The autopsy confirmed that the woman had died of heart failure. Her son was eventually found and received the psychological help he needed. The charges against him were relatively minor, considering the circumstances. They released me the next morning, but my nightmare was far from over. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I transported a dead person for over half an hour, and somehow she had spoken to me. She had known her son wasn't coming back before I did. The experience completely shattered my understanding of reality. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep, couldn't get back in my cab without feeling sick to my stomach. My wife finally convinced me to see a therapist, which probably saved my sanity. It took months of counseling before I could even think about driving again. Before I went back to work, I had a priest bless my cab. I know it might sound superstitious, but I needed to feel like I'd done everything possible to cleanse whatever energy might still be lingering there. I eventually returned to driving, but I was never the same. Every elderly passenger made me nervous. Every quiet ride had me checking the rearview mirror constantly, looking for signs of life. I retired from cab driving 2 years ago and now work at a hardware store. It's boring compared to the taxi business, but boring is exactly what I need. I sleep better at night knowing that all my customers are definitely, provably alive. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm alone. I've never been able to explain what happened, and honestly, I've stopped trying. Some things in this world don't have explanations that make sense to the living. All I know is that, for a few minutes on a February night in Phoenix. A woman who had already passed on to whatever comes next took one last cab ride with her troubled son, and somehow found the strength to let me know that he was never coming back. Whether you believe me or not doesn't matter to me anymore. I know what I heard, and I know what I experienced, and that's enough. My name is Robert, and I've been a taxi driver for more than 18 years. I've worked all areas of Boston during every possible shift, but I've always preferred the night hours. There's less traffic, less noise, and generally fewer problems. People just want to get to their destination, and I like the peace of driving without the stress of rush hour. I'm not one of those people who believe in paranormal things, ghost stories, or anything like that. I've always thought everything has a logical explanation, but what happened to me one night a few years ago still leaves me wondering. I had a regular client, a man named Thomas. He worked at a law firm downtown and used to take my service when he worked late. We didn't talk much, but he was polite and always tipped well. He was one of those clients you like to have because they don't cause problems, and you can count on steady, reliable rides. That night I received his call as usual. I checked the address and saw it was the same as always, his office building in the financial district. I didn't think much about it, just marked the trip and drove over there. The route was clear, but as I got closer to the area, I noticed something strange. A thick fog was covering the street. It wasn't normal. That part of the city is all tall buildings and concrete, and I had never seen mist like that there before. It seemed odd, but I didn't give it much importance. I arrived at the address and parked in front of the building. The street was completely empty, not a single car, not a pedestrian. The building was also dark, which was strange because there were always lights on in the lobby and at least one security guard at the entrance. I waited a few minutes and Thomas didn't come out. I wasn't too worried at first because sometimes he took his time, so I decided to call him. The phone rang several times, but no one answered. That's when I started feeling uncomfortable. I kept staring at the building hoping to see some sign of movement, but nothing. I looked at the fog. It seemed to have gotten thicker, as if everything around me was being enclosed in a bubble. I decided to get out of the car. I walked to the building entrance, but it was completely locked. I knocked on the glass doors and called for the security guard, but there was no response. I turned around to go back to the taxi, and that's when I noticed something. The back door of my car was open. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't felt any movement at all, but there it was, completely open. I approached slowly, feeling a chill run down my spine. When I looked inside, I saw the back seat. It was wet, as if someone completely soaked had been sitting there. I looked around searching for some explanation, someone who might have passed by, but there was no one, just the silence of the street and the fog that kept getting thicker. I slammed the door shut and got in the car, started it as fast as I could, and drove away from there. I didn't understand what had happened, but I didn't want to stay to find out. The next day, still with that strange feeling in my body, I told what happened to a friend of mine, another taxi driver who worked the same area. I expected him to laugh at me, or tell me that surely some drunk had gotten into the car without me noticing, but instead, his expression changed. He remained silent for a moment, and then asked me what Thomas I was talking about. I gave him his full name and watched him turn pale. He looked at me intently and told me something that left me frozen. Thomas had died 2 weeks earlier. He told me he had been hit by a drunk driver on that same street, just a few meters from where I had been waiting for him. The driver had struck him down as he was crossing at night after working late. I didn't know what to say. Everything I had felt the night before took on a much more terrifying meaning. I never received calls from his number again, and I didn't go back to that street either. I didn't want to think about what had really happened that night. And to this day, I still don't want to think about it. The only thing I can imagine is that maybe Thomas manifested himself in that fog, trying to complete what he wanted to accomplish that night. Simply getting home to his family. But what haunts me most is thinking about all those months I drove him to that building. How many times had I been taking a dead man to work? How many conversations had I had with someone who was no longer there? I've heard other drivers talk about strange passengers, people who get in and then vanish. But I never believed those stories until it happened to me. Now, I understand that death doesn't always mean the end of routine. Sometimes, people keep trying to live the life they lost, riding in taxis to jobs they no longer have, trying to get home to families who are still waiting for them to walk through the door. Being a night cab driver is a strange job. You get used to seeing everything: drunks, couples fighting, clients who don't say a word the entire trip, and others who talk to themselves. Over time, you stop being surprised by the things that happen in the early morning hours, but there are nights that mark you forever. Even if you don't fully understand them, you know you'll never forget them. And sometimes, on particularly foggy nights, when the city seems wrapped in silence and the streets are empty, I still check my rearview mirror more often than I should. Because now I know that not everyone who gets in your cab is necessarily alive, and not everyone who calls for a ride is calling from this world. I've been driving cab for most of my adult life, and before rideshare apps took over, it was actually a decent way to make a living. I've got countless stories from those years, some funny, some scary, some just plain weird. But this one story stands out above all the rest, and not in a good way. This happened back in 2009, during a particularly rough period in Detroit's history. The city was falling apart, entire neighborhoods were being abandoned, and crime was through the roof. But I had a family to feed, so I kept driving, even when common sense told me to find a safer line of work. It was a Thursday night, sometime after 11, when I picked up this passenger. He was standing on a corner in one of the rougher parts of town, a heavy-set guy in his 60s with a permanently sour expression. His clothes were dirty, and he had this angry look about him that immediately put me on guard. In this business, you learn to read people quickly, and this guy was setting off all my internal alarm bells. He got in without saying hello and just mumbled an address in a neighborhood that was mostly abandoned houses and empty lots. I'd been there before. It was the kind of place where even the street lights had been shot out and never replaced. But a fare is a fare, so I started driving. The only thing he brought with him was a large, dirty canvas bag that he'd tossed onto the seat next to him. It looked heavy, and when I politely asked if he could put it on the floor so it wouldn't dirty up my freshly cleaned seats, he gave me a look that could have melted steel. But he moved it. The ride to his neighborhood took about 25 minutes, and he didn't say a word the entire time. I was fine with that. Some passengers just want to sit in silence, and after the day I'd had, quiet was actually preferred. When we got to a street, I could see why the area had been basically abandoned. Half the houses were burned out shells, and the rest looked like they'd been empty for years. Tall weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalks, and there were no signs of normal life anywhere. No porch lights, no cars in driveways, no indication that anyone still lived there. His house was at the very end of the block, a small single-story place that looked like it was barely standing. The yard was completely overgrown, and several windows were boarded up. When we pulled up, he got out without paying me. I called after him, telling him what the meter read, and he turned around with that same hostile expression. "Wait here," he growled. "I'll get your money." Every instinct I had was telling me to drive away right then. This whole situation felt wrong, but I also couldn't afford to eat a $25 fare, so I waited. While he was inside, I noticed movement in one of the front windows. Someone was trying to get my attention. At first, I could only make out a shadowy figure, but then a young woman pressed her face against the glass. She was mouthing words at me, and even though I couldn't hear her through the window, I could read her lips clearly. "Help me." The terror in her eyes was unmistakable. She looked like she'd been crying, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid someone would catch her at the window. Then she held up her hands, and I could see that her wrists were bound. My blood went cold. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, the man came back out of the house. When I looked back at the window, the woman was gone. He approached my car and shoved some crumpled bills through the passenger window, then told me to get lost in language I won't repeat here. After he went back inside, I drove around the block and parked where I could still see the house, but wasn't directly in front of it. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I'd given them the address and told them I had reason to believe someone was being held against their will inside. I expected the man to refuse to let them in, maybe try to hide whatever was going on in there. Instead, he opened the door right away and seemed almost eager to let the officers inside. That made me start to doubt myself. If he was holding someone captive, why would he be so willing to let the police search his house? Maybe I'd misunderstood what I'd seen in the window. I waited in my car, watching the house and trying to figure out what was happening. About 20 minutes later, I saw them bringing the man out in handcuffs. Then 2 more police cars arrived, followed by what looked like a coroner's van. I drove closer and identified myself as the person who'd called in the tip. One of the officers confirmed that they'd found a woman in the house, but then he told me something that made my stomach drop. "She's been dead for over 24 hours, he said. "Coroner thinks maybe longer." I couldn't process what he was telling me, but I saw her in the window. She was asking for help. The officer asked me to describe what I'd seen. And when I told him about the young woman with dark hair who'd been trying to get my attention, his expression changed. "That matches the victim," he said. "How could you have known what she looked like?" I had no answer for that. They searched the entire house and found no one else alive inside. The man confessed to everything pretty quickly. He'd been holding the woman for days before finally killing her. The canvas bag he'd brought in my cab contained a shovel and other tools he'd planned to use to bury her body in the empty lot behind his house. The only conclusion I could reach was that somehow this young woman had managed to reach out from beyond death to make sure her killer didn't get away with it. She'd made sure I saw her, made sure I called for help, made sure her body would be found and returned to her family, instead of disappearing forever in an unmarked grave. I think about her sometimes, and I hope that wherever she is now, she's found peace. And I think about what might have happened if I hadn't been there that night, if some other cabbie had taken that fare, if no one had seen her desperate plea for help in that window. Sometimes doing the right thing means putting yourself at risk. But sometimes, if you're really lucky, you get help from the most unexpected places. My name is Marcus, and I'm a guitar instructor at a community college in San Antonio, Texas. I've been teaching music for 8 years now, and I absolutely love what I do. My last class of the day ends at 9 p.m., which means I usually take the city bus home. But on this particular evening in October of 2022, I decided to treat myself to a taxi ride instead. It was my mother's birthday, and I wanted to stop by her house to give her the present I'd been saving up for, a beautiful vintage music box that played her favorite song from the 1960s. Taking a taxi would save me almost an hour compared to the bus route, and I was eager to see the look on her face when she opened the gift. The taxi arrived within 15 minutes of my call, which was unusually quick for that time of night. The driver was a middle-aged Hispanic man named Roberto, who greeted me with a warm smile and helped me carefully place my guitar case in the front seat. "Long day?" he asked as we pulled away from the college. "The best kind," I replied. "I love what I do. There's nothing like seeing a student finally master a piece they've been struggling with." Roberto nodded knowingly. "My daughter plays piano. I understand that feeling." The ride to my mother's house was about 30 minutes through the city, past the historic downtown area, and into the residential neighborhoods on the south side. I was exhausted from a full day of teaching, and despite my excitement about the birthday surprise, I found myself starting to doze off in the back seat. I wasn't fully asleep, more like that drowsy state where you're still somewhat aware of your surroundings, but your mind starts to drift. My guitar case was secure beside me, and Roberto was a careful driver, so I allowed myself to relax. I have fairly long hair. It reaches almost to my shoulders, and I often tie it back while teaching, but I'd let it down for the evening. As I sat there with my eyes closed, I began to feel something very strange. It started as the lightest touch, like a gentle breeze moving through my hair. But gradually, it became more deliberate, more purposeful. Someone was running their fingers through my hair, stroking it in a way that felt almost intimate. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sensation was so soft, so gentle, that it felt like something my subconscious might conjure up. But then, I felt fingertips brush against my neck, and those fingers were ice cold, so cold that they sent a shock through my entire nervous system. The touching became more insistent. I could feel my hair being lifted, separated into sections, almost as if someone was examining it. Then, without warning, I felt a sharp tug that made me gasp and sit up straight. My eyes snapped open, and I immediately turned to look beside me. The back seat was empty. There was no one there except me. "Everything okay back there?" Roberto called out, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I think so," I stammered, rubbing the back of my neck where those cold fingers had touched me. I felt like someone was playing with my hair. Roberto's expression in the mirror changed from casual concern to something more serious. He was quiet for a moment, then sighed heavily. "You're not the first person to tell me that," he said quietly. "Ever since I bought this cab 6 months ago, passengers have been complaining about unusual experiences." "What kind of experiences?" "Things like what you just described. People feel like they're being touched, or they hear whispers, or they sense someone sitting next to them when they're alone back there. One lady swore she felt someone breathing on her neck. I looked around the interior of the taxi with new eyes. It was clean and well-maintained, nothing obviously wrong with it. But now that Roberto had mentioned it, there was something about the atmosphere that felt heavy. "Do you know anything about the history of this car?" I asked. Roberto shook his head. "I bought it from a used car lot in Austin. The dealer said it had been a fleet vehicle for another taxi company, but they were getting rid of their older cars to upgrade. The price was so good that I didn't ask too many questions." "But you've noticed things too." "At first, I thought my passengers were just trying to get out of paying the fare, making up stories about ghosts to distract me. But it happens too often, and the people are genuinely scared. Plus," he paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Plus what?" "Sometimes when I'm driving alone, I hear voices coming from the back seat. Conversations, like there are two people back there talking quietly. But when I look in the mirror, there's nobody there." A chill ran down my spine. The touching sensation had been bad enough, but the idea that there might be multiple spirits in this car was truly unsettling. "Have you considered getting the car blessed or something?" I suggested. Roberto laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My wife has been telling me the same thing for months. She won't even ride in this car anymore, says it gives her bad dreams. But I've been stubborn about it. I don't really believe in that kind of stuff, I believe in what I can see and touch. But you can't deny what your passengers are experiencing." "No, I can't. And to be honest, it's starting to affect my business. Word gets around, and people are beginning to request different drivers when they call the company. We were getting close to my mother's neighborhood now, and I was grateful for that." The atmosphere in the car had become increasingly oppressive, as if whatever presence was, there was responding to our conversation about it. "You should really consider having someone come and cleanse the car," I said. "There are people who specialize in that kind of thing." "Yeah, maybe you're right. I can't keep losing customers because of this." When we arrived at my mother's house, I was eager to get out of the taxi. I paid Roberto and wished him luck with his supernatural problem. As I walked toward the front door, I heard him call out behind me, "Hey Marcus, check your guitar case." I turned back, puzzled. "What do you mean, just check it, make sure everything's okay?" I set the case down on my mother's front porch and opened it under the light. What I saw made my blood run cold. 3 deep scratches ran across the surface of my guitar, scratches that definitely hadn't been there when I'd left the college. The marks looked like claw marks, as if something with very sharp fingernails had deliberately raked across the wood. The scratches were deep enough to have damaged the instrument's finish and possibly affected its sound quality. I looked back at Roberto, who was still parked at the curb, and held up the guitar so he could see the damage. Even from that distance, I could see his face go pale. He rolled down his window and called out, "I'm so sorry, man. I'll pay for the repairs." "It's not your fault," I called back, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Roberto drove away, and I stood there on the porch for several minutes, staring at my damaged guitar. The scratches were precise, deliberate, and they hadn't been there when I'd gotten into the taxi. Whatever had been touching my hair had also been working on destroying my instrument. I spent the evening with my mother, and she loved her birthday present. But I couldn't fully enjoy the celebration because I kept thinking about what had happened in that taxi. The experience had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. A few days later, I called the taxi company to ask about Roberto. The dispatcher told me he'd taken his car off the road and was having it professionally cleaned, whatever that meant. I hoped for his sake that it worked. I never saw Roberto again, but I occasionally wondered if he'd managed to solve his supernatural problem. I also wondered about the history of that taxi, about what had happened inside it to leave such a strong spiritual imprint. My guitar was repairable, thankfully, though the scratches left permanent scars in the wood. Every time I play it now, I'm reminded of that night and the feeling of those ice-cold fingers running through my hair. I've taken many taxi rides since then, but I always make sure to stay alert and aware of my surroundings. I've learned that some vehicles carry more than just passengers. They carry memories, emotions, and sometimes the lingering presence of those who are no longer with us. Whatever was in Roberto's taxi that night, I pray it's found peace. And I hope Roberto was able to reclaim his livelihood without fear of supernatural interference. Some burdens are too heavy for the living to carry alone, and sometimes the best we can do is acknowledge the presence of the unseen and try to help them find their way to whatever comes next. My name is Sarah, and I need to share something that happened to me during my college years in rural Oregon. This was back in 2008, when I was studying at Portland State University, but living in a small town about 45 minutes away by car. Coming from a working-class family, we didn't have the luxury of a second vehicle, so I relied entirely on public transportation. Every morning, I'd catch the early Greyhound bus to Portland, then transfer to the city bus that would drop me near campus. The routine was exhausting but manageable, and I'd grown accustomed to the long commute. The return journey followed the same pattern: city bus to the Greyhound station, then the regional bus back to my small town. I had to time everything perfectly to catch the last bus that departed at 9:15 p.m., or I'd be stranded in the city overnight. One particular Thursday evening, my study group decided to work late on our psychology project. We met at Jessica's apartment near campus and lost track of time completely. When I finally glanced at my phone, it was already past 8:30, and panic set in. There was no way I could make it to the bus station in time for the last bus. Jessica immediately offered to call me a cab, insisting she'd cover the fare. I was hesitant about the expense, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. This was before rideshare apps existed, so traditional taxi companies were the only option for late-night transportation. The cab arrived within 20 minutes. The driver was a pleasant man in his late 30s named Mike, who seemed genuinely friendly and professional. Since it was such a long distance to my town, we struck up a conversation to pass the time. He told me about his family, his other job at a local garage, and how he'd been driving nights to make ends meet. We were cruising along Highway 47, the main route that connected Portland to the smaller communities. This particular stretch was notorious for being poorly lit, with dense pine forests on both sides creating an almost tunnel-like effect. The darkness was so complete that our headlights seemed to barely penetrate it. About 20 minutes into the drive, we both spotted her at the same time, an elderly woman walking along the shoulder of the highway, waving her arm to flag down our taxi. Mike immediately began to slow down, rolling down his window to explain that he already had a passenger. I was about to tell him it would be fine to pick her up, that I didn't mind sharing the ride, when I got a clear look at her face. The woman's expression changed instantly when Mike told her he was occupied. Her features twisted into something absolutely malevolent, a look of pure hatred that made my blood run cold. She was short and hunched, probably in her 70s, with wild gray hair partially covered by a dark shawl. But it was her eyes that truly terrified me. They held a malice so intense, so unnatural, that every instinct in my body screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. Mike accelerated past her, and I could see in the side mirror that she was standing perfectly still, watching our taillights disappear into the darkness. Her presence had filled me with such dread that I was actually shaking. "Did you see the way she looked at us?" Mike asked, his voice noticeably tense. "Yeah," I managed to reply. "That was unsettling." "I've been driving this route for 3 years," he continued, "and I've never seen anyone walking out here at night. It's at least 15 miles to the nearest house in either direction." We drove in relative silence for the next few miles, both of us still processing what we'd witnessed. Mike kept checking his mirrors, and I found myself doing the same, though I couldn't say exactly what I was looking for. Then, without warning, the taxi began to shudder. At first, it felt like we'd hit a rough patch of road, but the vibrations quickly became more violent and irregular. The engine started making a grinding noise I'd never heard before, and Mike's face went pale in the dashboard light. "This can't be happening," he muttered, wrestling with the steering wheel as the car lurched and bucked. "I just had this thing serviced last week. Everything was perfect." The taxi gave one final, violent shudder before the engine died completely. We coasted to a stop on the shoulder, the sudden silence almost deafening after the mechanical chaos. Mike tried turning the key several times, but got nothing, not even a click. He apologized profusely as he got out to check under the hood, leaving me alone in the darkened interior. I used the opportunity to call my parents, letting them know I'd be late due to car trouble. I was just hanging up when I heard it, a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was laughter, but not the kind you'd ever want to hear. It was high-pitched, cackling, and filled with malicious glee. The sound seemed to be getting closer. Turning in my seat, I peered through the rear window and felt my heart nearly stop. The old woman was approaching us, moving far faster than someone her age should be able to manage. She was using a gnarled walking stick, but her pace was almost unnaturally quick. As she got closer, her laughter grew louder and more unhinged. Then she began shouting at Mike, who was still bent over the engine. "You should have stopped for me," she cackled. "You should have let me in. Now look what you've done to yourself." Her voice carried an odd quality, as if it was coming from multiple directions at once. Mike straightened up, wrench in hand, staring at her in complete bewilderment. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about," he called back. My car just broke down. It has nothing to do with you. But she just laughed harder, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a hyena's howl. Oh, but it does, young man. It has everything to do with me. I told you to stop, and you didn't listen. Now you'll learn what happens to those who ignore their elders. I rolled down my window and called out to Mike, "Get back in the car. Now." Something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency I felt, because he immediately slammed the hood and rushed back to the driver's seat, locking all the doors behind him. The woman had reached our taxi by then and was standing just outside Mike's window, her face pressed close to the glass. Up close, she was even more terrifying. Her skin was a sickly pale color, almost translucent, and several of her teeth were missing. But her eyes were the worst part. They seemed to glow with their own inner light, like a predator's eyes caught in headlights. She began tapping on the window with her walking stick, each tap deliberate and rhythmic. "Let me in," she crooned in a sing-song voice. "Let me in, and maybe I'll fix your little problem." Mike was fumbling with his phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. We were in one of those dead zones that plagued rural highways. "If you don't let me in," the woman continued, her voice now dropping to a threatening whisper, "things are going to get much worse for both of you. Much, much worse." I wanted to look away, but I found myself mesmerized by her horrible presence. She began walking around the car slowly, trailing her stick along the windows and doors, creating an awful scraping sound that seemed to penetrate right into my bones. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she circled our taxi like a vulture, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize, and occasionally letting out that bone-chilling laugh. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she stopped. The scraping ceased, the muttering ended, and even her laughter died away. We sat in complete silence, afraid to move or speak. Finally, Mike whispered, "Is she gone?" I carefully turned to look out the rear window. The highway behind us was empty, stretching away into darkness. There was no sign of the woman anywhere. "I think so," I whispered back. Mike turned the key in the ignition, more out of hope than expectation. To our amazement, the engine roared to life immediately, purring as smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. We didn't speak for the rest of the journey. Mike drove faster than he probably should have, but I didn't complain. All I wanted was to get home, to be surrounded by familiar walls and the people I loved. When we finally reached my house, I paid Mike double the agreed fare. He tried to refuse the extra money, but I insisted. We'd shared something that night that neither of us would ever forget, and I felt we were bonded by that terrible experience. I went to bed that night but didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face, heard her laughter echoing in my ears. Even now, 15 years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those glowing eyes and that malevolent smile. The next morning, I called the taxi company to check on Mike, wanting to make sure he was okay. The dispatcher told me that Mike's taxi had been found wrapped around a tree on Highway 47 at around 3 a.m., about 10 miles past where he dropped me off. Mike was in critical condition at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. According to the police report, there were no skid marks, no evidence of what might have caused him to lose control. The investigating officer noted that it appeared as though the steering wheel had simply been wrenched from Mike's hands by some tremendous force. I visited Mike in the hospital a week later. He was conscious but heavily bandaged, with a broken arm, several cracked ribs, and a severe concussion. When he saw me, his eyes filled with recognition and something else, fear. "She was there," he whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "After I dropped you off, she was standing in the middle of the road. I tried to swerve around her, but the wheel, it just turned on its own. The last thing I remember was her laughing." Mike recovered from his physical injuries, but he never drove a taxi again. He moved away from Oregon shortly after getting out of the hospital, and I never heard from him again. As for me, I transferred to a college closer to home the following semester. I never drove Highway 47 again, and I never will. Some roads are meant to be avoided, and some encounters are meant to serve as warnings. I still wonder sometimes about that woman, about what she was and what she wanted. Part of me hopes she was just a troubled person having a mental health crisis. But deep down, I know better. There was something fundamentally inhuman about her. Something that belonged to the darkness between the trees, rather than the world of ordinary people. Whatever she was, I pray that no one else ever has to encounter her on that lonely stretch of highway. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some stories are better left unfinished. My name is David, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I only drove a taxi for about 8 months, back when I was in graduate school at Portland State. My father had been a cabbie his whole life, and when he got sick with pneumonia one winter and couldn't work, he asked me to take over his evening shifts to help pay his bills. I wasn't particularly good at the job. I'm naturally introverted and have always struggled with small talk, which is pretty much essential when you're driving strangers around the city. My dad, on the other hand, was a natural. He knew half his regular customers by name and had genuine friendships with some of them. I would finish my classes around 3:30 each afternoon, grab a quick bite to eat, and then hit the road by 5 p.m. The routine was the same every day for months. It was a rainy Thursday in March when everything changed. I was driving through the Hawthorne district when a woman flagged me down near a bus stop. She was probably in her 60s, wearing a black wool coat and carrying a small purse. She seemed a bit frail, but alert. "Could you take me to Gresham and Powell Funeral Home?" she asked as she got into the back seat. "It's not too far from here." "Of course," I said, though I'd never been to that particular funeral home before. I punched the address into my GPS and started driving. The woman was quiet during the ride, occasionally looking out the window at the passing neighborhoods. I tried to give her space. It was obvious she was dealing with something difficult, probably the loss of someone close to her. When we reached the funeral home, she thanked me, paid the fare, and headed inside. I was about to drive away when I realized I should check that I had her payment right. I'd been having trouble making change earlier and wanted to make sure everything was correct. But as I was counting the bills, I noticed something in the backseat. The woman had left her purse behind. I couldn't just drive away with someone's purse, especially someone who was clearly at a funeral home dealing with a loss. I grabbed it and hurried inside to find her. The funeral home was busier than I expected. There were quite a few people milling around the lobby, and I could see into a large viewing room where a service was taking place. I scanned the crowd, looking for the woman in the black coat. As I searched, I noticed a large portrait on an easel near the entrance to the viewing room. It showed an elderly man in a dark suit and fedora hat, probably from the 1940s or 50s, based on the style of the photograph. He had a distinguished look, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. I finally spotted my passenger near the back of the viewing room, sitting in one of the folding chairs. I made my way over to her, trying to be as quiet and respectful as possible. "Excuse me, ma'am," I whispered. "You left this in my cab." She looked up, surprised, and then smiled gratefully. "Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost that." She tried to offer me a tip, but I declined. It felt wrong to accept money in a place like that at a time like that. I left the funeral home and continued working. About an hour later, I was driving past Lloyd's Center Mall when a young man flagged me down. But as I started to pull over, he waved me off. "Sorry, I didn't realize you already had a passenger," he called out. I looked in my rearview mirror, confused. "I don't have a passenger." The guy approached my window and pointed toward the backseat. "Dude, there's an old man in a suit and hat sitting right there. I saw him when you drove up." I turned around to look at my backseat. It was empty. "There's nobody there," I said. But the young man was insistent. "I swear I saw him. An older guy in a dark suit and one of those old-fashioned hats. Are you sure he's not back there?" A chill ran down my spine. That description matched the man in the portrait at the funeral home perfectly. The same suit, the same style of hat, even the general appearance. Did he look like he was from another era? I asked, though I felt ridiculous asking it. "Yeah, exactly, like something out of an old movie. Classic suit, fedora, the whole thing." The young man decided not to take the ride. I don't blame him. If I'd been in his position, I probably would have done the same thing. I spent the rest of my shift constantly checking my rearview mirror, but I never saw anything. When I got home, I called my mother and told her what had happened. She suggested I come home early and maybe take a break from driving for a few days. I agreed, but first I wanted to understand what had happened. The next day, I drove back to the funeral home, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was hoping to accomplish. The same portrait was still on the easel in the lobby, but now there was no crowd, no service taking place. I found one of the funeral directors and asked him about the man in the photograph. "That's Mr. William Hendricks," he told me. "Wonderful man. He passed away Tuesday night. The viewing was yesterday afternoon." "Did he have family here?" I asked. "Oh yes, quite a few people came to pay their respects. His wife passed away about 15 years ago, but they had no children. Mostly it was neighbors, friends from his church, people like that." I described the woman I'd driven to the funeral home, and the director nodded. "That sounds like Mrs. Patterson. She lived next door to Bill for over 30 years. She was very devoted to him after his wife died, brought him meals, checked on him regularly. She was quite upset about his passing. I thanked him and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something about the way Mrs. Patterson had acted in my cab, something about the timing of everything. That evening, I decided to drive by the neighborhood where the funeral home director said Mr. Hendricks had lived. I found the address and parked across the street from a small craftsman-style house. I sat there for a while, not sure what I was looking for. Then I saw her, Mrs. Patterson, coming out of the house next door with a small watering can, tending to some plants on her front porch. I got out of my cab and approached her carefully. I didn't want to frighten her or seem like I was stalking her. "Mrs. Patterson," I called out, "I'm the taxi driver from yesterday. I returned your purse at the funeral home." She looked up and smiled. "Oh yes, of course. Thank you again for that." "I hope you don't think this is strange," I said, "but I wanted to ask you about Mr. Hendricks, the man whose funeral you attended." Her expression softened. "Bill was like family to me. I looked after him for years, especially after Martha, his wife, passed away. He was such a kind man." "Were you close to him?" "Very close. I was with him when he died, actually. He'd been in the hospital for a few days, and I was sitting with him Tuesday night when he passed. It was very peaceful." She paused, looking thoughtful. "You know, the strangest thing happened right after he died. I was holding his hand, and just before the nurses came in, I could have sworn I heard him say, 'Thank you, Dorothy. I'll see you home.' But that was impossible, of course." "Why do you say that?" "Because Bill had been unconscious for hours. And besides, my name isn't Dorothy, that was his wife's name. I'm Margaret." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something else? Yesterday, when I drove you to the funeral home, do you remember anything unusual about the ride?" She thought for a moment. "Not really, although I did have the strangest feeling that Bill was with me somehow, like he was making sure I got there safely for his service. I know that sounds foolish." "It doesn't sound foolish at all," I said. I thanked her and headed back to my cab. As I was walking away, she called out to me, "Young man, I don't suppose you felt anything unusual yesterday. During the ride, I mean." I turned back to her. Someone else saw him in my cab later that day, an elderly man in a suit and hat, sitting in the back seat. Mrs. Patterson smiled, but it wasn't a smile of surprise. It was a smile of recognition. "That sounds like Bill," she said quietly. "Always the gentleman. He probably wanted to make sure his neighbors got home safely from his funeral." I never drove a taxi again after that. I finished out the week, but I couldn't concentrate on driving anymore. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I wondered if I was really alone in the car. My father recovered from his pneumonia and went back to work. I focused on finishing my degree. I never told him about what happened. He was already dealing with enough health issues without me adding supernatural encounters to his list of worries. But sometimes, when I'm driving my own car now, I think about Mr. Hendricks and Mrs. Patterson. I think about the bonds we form with the people in our lives, and how maybe, just maybe, those bonds are strong enough to survive even death. I hope that when my time comes, I'll be fortunate enough to have someone like Mrs. Patterson to sit with me at the end. And I hope that if I need to make one last journey, I'll have the strength to see it through, just like Mr. Hendricks did on that rainy March evening in Portland. My name is Marcus, and I've been driving a cab in Chicago for over 15 years. I've seen it all: drunk college kids, late-night emergencies, sketchy neighborhoods at 3 in the morning. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me 3 years ago. I usually worked the evening shift, from about 6 p.m. until 2 in the morning. The money was better during those hours, especially around the bar district and near Union Station. Competition was lighter, and people were more willing to pay surge prices. It was a Tuesday night in November, around 11:30, when this woman flagged me down on North Michigan Avenue. She was middle-aged, maybe in her 50s, wearing a long, dark coat. What caught my attention immediately was the large gym bag she was struggling with. The thing looked incredibly heavy, and she could barely lift it into the backseat. "Where to?" I asked as she settled in. "Downtown, near the merchandise mart," she said, giving me a specific address. "Just run the meter." The ride started normal enough. She sat quietly in the back, occasionally glancing at her phone. I tried making small talk, but she seemed distracted, almost nervous. The bag sat beside her, taking up most of the seat space. When we reached her destination, I was surprised. It was a pretty desolate area. Most of the shops were closed, streetlights were dim, and there wasn't a soul walking around. It felt more like an industrial zone than a residential area. "You sure this is the right place?" I asked, looking around. "Yes, this is perfect," she insisted, handing me the fare plus a decent tip. She struggled with the bag again, finally managing to drag it out of the car, and disappeared into the shadows between two buildings. I drove off, thinking nothing more of it. About 2 hours later, I picked up a young guy outside a nightclub in River North. As he slid into the backseat, he immediately pushed something with his foot. "Dude, there's a bag back here," he said. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, the same gym bag the woman had been carrying. She must have forgotten it in all the struggle to get out. After dropping the guy off at his apartment, I pulled over to examine the bag. There were no external pockets with identification, no luggage tags, nothing. I didn't want to invade someone's privacy, but I needed to find a phone number or address to return it. Reluctantly, I unzipped the bag. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. A pale hand was sticking out, and for a split second, I thought I was looking at a corpse. I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing it was plastic parts of a mannequin, all disassembled and packed carefully inside. I zipped the bag back up, figuring I'd return to that area the next evening to look for the woman. Maybe she worked in one of those buildings or lived nearby. I drove home to my apartment in Lincoln Park. I was single at the time and lived alone, which becomes important later. I parked in my assigned spot in the underground garage, locked the car with the bag still in the backseat, and went upstairs to get some sleep. The next evening, around 5:30, I headed down to the garage to start my shift. My plan was to drive back to that area downtown first, see if I could spot the woman. But when I reached my car, I froze. Sitting in the backseat, perfectly assembled and upright, was the mannequin. It was positioned as if it were a real passenger, sitting normally, facing forward, with that unsettling frozen smile that all display mannequins have. The smile seemed different somehow, more sinister than I remembered. I approached the rear window slowly, my hands shaking. The mannequin was completely put together: head, torso, arms, legs, everything that had been in pieces the night before. It was wearing what looked like a vintage dress, something from the 1950s maybe, and its glass eyes seemed to be staring directly ahead. My garage was secure. You needed a key card to get in, and my car had been locked. There was absolutely no way someone could have gotten in there and assembled this thing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe the mannequin hadn't been completely disassembled. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Finally, I got in the car. I was determined to find that woman and give her back her property, or her problem, whatever this thing was. If I couldn't find her, I was planning to dump the whole thing in a dumpster somewhere. I didn't want it in my cab for another second. I started driving toward downtown, trying to ignore the presence in my backseat. But about halfway there, while stopped at a red light on La Salle Street, I glanced up at my rearview mirror. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The mannequin's head had turned. It was no longer facing forward. It was looking directly at me through the mirror. I watched, paralyzed, as it slowly rotated back to face forward, as if it had been caught staring and was trying to act normal. Cars behind me started honking. The light had turned green, but I was sitting there in shock, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I forced myself to drive, but I angled the rearview mirror so I couldn't see the backseat anymore. When I reached the area where I'd dropped off the woman, I parked and got out immediately. I wasn't staying in that car with that thing for another second. I waited on the sidewalk, watching people pass by, hoping to spot her. Several potential fares approached me, but I had to turn them all away. How could I explain that I couldn't take passengers because there was a possessed mannequin in my backseat? Around 10 o'clock, just as the few remaining shops were closing, I saw her. The same woman, walking briskly down the street with her head down. I ran to catch up with her. "Excuse me, ma'am," I called out. She didn't recognize me at first, but when I explained who I was, her face went pale. "You need to take this thing back," I said, probably more aggressively than I should have. "It was left in my car, and there's something seriously wrong with it." She stopped walking and looked at me with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do." Then she told me a story that chilled me to the bone. Her daughter had lost her husband in a car accident 6 months earlier. Unable to cope with the grief, the daughter had sought out someone who claimed they could help, someone who practiced what she called spiritual consultation. They told her they could bring his spirit back, let him inhabit something so she could have him close, the woman explained. My daughter brought them one of those old mannequins from her husband's vintage clothing store. She paid them a lot of money. But whatever had come back wasn't her son-in-law. Strange things started happening in her daughter's house, objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds. And the mannequin would be found in different positions and rooms, without anyone moving it. My daughter finally realized it wasn't him, she continued. Whatever was in that thing was something else, something dark. She begged me to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. I was taking it to throw it in the river, but then I panicked and just ran. I felt a mix of anger and sympathy. I was furious that she'd essentially dumped this supernatural problem on me, but I could also understand a mother's desperation to help her child. "I don't care what it is or where it came from," I told her firmly. "You need to take it back right now." She nodded reluctantly. I led her to my car, opened the back door, and there it was, still sitting there with that horrible smile. Together, we managed to get it out of the car. She wrapped her arms around it awkwardly, and without another word, she walked away into the night. I never saw her again, and I never found out what happened to that mannequin. But I said a prayer for both of them, the mother and her grieving daughter, hoping they found a way to deal with whatever they had brought into their lives. That experience taught me something important. There are some things in this world that are better left alone. When we try to bring back what's gone, Sometimes we open doors that should stay closed forever. I still drive cab in Chicago, but I'm a lot more careful about who I pick up and what they bring with them. Some nights, when I'm driving alone through the city, I still check my rearview mirror more often than I should, just to make sure I'm the only one in the car. And I never, ever transport mannequins. My name doesn't matter, but what I'm about to tell you does. I was a taxi driver in the 1980s when working the night shift was a different kind of business. The streets were lonelier, the clients more peculiar, and the rides sometimes longer than expected. In those years, there were no apps or modern radio dispatch systems. You built up regular customers through trust, people who preferred to call someone reliable directly rather than flag down a random cab on the street. That's how I met one of the strangest clients I ever had in my entire career. He was a man in his late 40s, reserved, with a weathered face and hard eyes. He wasn't rude, but he wasn't friendly either. He would only call me when he needed transport to one specific destination. An old farmhouse, about 15 miles outside the city, a couple miles beyond a small rural community. He never had me pick him up at his home. It was always different locations, as if he didn't want me to know where he lived. He always carried with him a brown leather suitcase, which he never let out of his sight. I didn't interfere in his business or ask questions for me. He was just another customer. He seemed to like my discretion, because over time he stopped using other taxi services and only called me. For months I drove him to that farmhouse. It was an old structure with a sagging roof and peeling paint, like it had been abandoned for years. I never went inside or saw anyone else there, but every time I dropped him off, he would take his suitcase and enter without looking back. It was a routine I learned not to question. But one night, everything changed. That time, he didn't ask me to take him there. He called me to pick him up. It was the first time he had ever done that. When I arrived, he was standing outside the farmhouse, suitcase in hand as always, but something felt different. As soon as he got in the taxi, I knew. The smell, a penetrating stench, rancid, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, maybe bleach or ammonia. I tried not to react, but my stomach turned. I had never smelled anything like that in the car, not even with the most careless customers. It couldn't be just sweat or dirty clothes. This was something else entirely. Looking through the rearview mirror, I saw that his expression hadn't changed, as if he didn't notice the odor. The trip was uncomfortable. The stench seemed to seep into the seats, into my clothes, into my lungs. This man didn't speak during the entire journey, just gave me the address of a shopping center in town, and when we arrived, he got out without saying anything more. I watched him walk away among the people, and for the first time in all the months I had known him, I felt that something was seriously wrong. I parked on a nearby street and sat there thinking, that smell, that place, the way he called me for the first time to pick him up instead of drop him off, it wasn't normal. I lit a cigarette to try to get rid of the sensation, but it didn't work. Now I was scared of this guy because he knew me very well, but something in my head told me I should do something. That if I stayed quiet, I was going to regret it. I took some quarters from my pocket, found a payphone, and dialed the police. Good evening. I want to make an anonymous report. I gave them the address of the farmhouse and told them about the smell. Out of fear, I didn't mention the passenger because I didn't want to get into trouble. I just said that something in that house wasn't right. I thought they wouldn't take it seriously, that they wouldn't go, or that at best they would find a dead animal or something like that. But that's not what happened. What they found was much worse. The next day on the radio, I heard the news. Police had found the body of a young woman in an abandoned farmhouse. She was in an advanced state of decomposition, but the strange thing was that she had been dressed in new clothes. A beautiful dress, clean. She even had a sparkling tiara in her hair, as if someone had been taking care of her appearance. But the most disturbing thing was the estimated date of her death. She had been dead for weeks, and I had driven him to that farmhouse several times during all that time. That thought made me feel a chill in my chest. That's when I called the police again. I told them about my passenger, about how I had been driving him there for months, about the suitcase he always carried with him. I gave them his description and mentioned that the last time I had dropped him off at the shopping center. I thought they would search for him and find him, but no, they never found him. There was no record of him anywhere. Nobody knew him. He had no registered address, no bank accounts. It was as if he had never existed. Days later, I went to the police station to give a formal statement. An officer showed me a photo of the woman. They told me she had disappeared almost 2 years earlier. And the worst part of all, they had never found evidence of assault, no sign that he had killed her violently. She had simply been kept there. He had maintained her alive until she died of natural causes, malnutrition, dehydration, despair. And when that happened, he continued treating her as if she were still alive. The case remained open. The police continued searching, but they found nothing more. Not him, no more evidence in the house, no clues to his whereabouts. And I, to this day, keep thinking about him, because in all those months, I never knew his name. I never knew what he carried in that suitcase. I never knew how much he talked to her. I never knew if he had other places like that farmhouse. And the worst part, I never knew if someday he might call me again. The thought that haunts me most is realizing I was an unwitting accomplice to his ritual. Every time I drove him there, I was helping him continue his sick game. The suitcase probably contained fresh clothes for her, makeup, jewelry, items to keep up the illusion that she was still a living person who needed to be dressed and cared for. I think about the woman often. How long was she alive in that place? Did she hear my taxi pulling up outside and hope that someone had come to rescue her? Did she know that just beyond those walls was a driver who could have helped her if only he had been curious enough to look? The police told me there were signs she had tried to escape multiple times. Scratches on the door frame, broken fingernails, worn spots on the floor where she had paced. But he always brought her back. And every time I drove him there, I was bringing him back to her. Sometimes I wonder if there were other women, other farmhouses, other taxi drivers who drove him around without knowing what they were really doing. How many of us were out there, unknowingly helping monsters hide in plain sight? I stopped driving taxi shortly after that. I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't trust my instincts about people, couldn't shake the feeling that every passenger might be hiding something terrible. But most of all, I couldn't forgive myself for not asking questions when every instinct told me something was wrong. If I could go back, I would have called the police the first time I smelled that stench. I would have followed him inside that farmhouse. I would have done something, anything, instead of just driving away and pretending everything was normal. But you can't change the past. All you can do is live with the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary moments, a regular fare, a routine pickup, a customer who pays well and doesn't cause trouble, can hide the most extraordinary evil. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still wonder, what if he's out there somewhere in another city, calling another taxi driver? What if right now, someone else is driving him to another farmhouse, another basement, another place where someone is waiting and hoping that this time, the person coming to the door might be there to save them instead of hurt them. The case made the newspapers for a few weeks, then disappeared from public memory. But I never forgot. How could I? Every time I see a taxi on the street, every time I hear about a missing person, every time someone mentions an anonymous tip that led to a discovery, I think about that man with the leather suitcase. And I think about her, the woman whose name I learned from the police report, but whose voice I never heard, whose face I only saw in a photograph after it was too late. She had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, maybe someone's girlfriend. She had a job, friends, a life that was cut short because she trusted the wrong person or was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police said she was a college student, studying to be a teacher. She had been walking home from her part-time job at a bookstore when she vanished. Her parents had spent 2 years looking for her, posting flyers, organizing search parties, never giving up hope that she would come home. I attended her funeral. I felt I owed her that much, even though her family didn't know who I was or why I was there. I stood in the back, listening to people talk about her dreams, her kindness, her love of children and books. And I thought about how different things might have been if I had just asked one question, made one phone call, followed one instinct. That's the burden I carry now. Not just that I unknowingly helped a killer, but that I had the chance to save someone and I didn't take it. That somewhere out there, evil continues to hide behind ordinary faces, and most of us are too polite, too busy, or too scared to look closely enough to see it. But I learned something else from that experience. Sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences. One anonymous phone call, one moment of courage, one decision to trust your gut instead of minding your own business. That can be the difference between life and death for someone you'll never meet. I may not be a taxi driver anymore, but I'm still here, still listening, still watching. And if I ever smell that smell again, if I ever see that look in someone's eyes, if I ever feel that cold certainty that something is terribly wrong, I won't hesitate. Because I know now that silence isn't just complicity. Sometimes silence is murder. Being a cab driver on the night shift in Chicago gets you used to seeing strange things, but it also teaches you not to ask too many questions. People get in with distant stares, couples screaming at each other, individuals who smell like alcohol or trouble. You learn to do your job and move on. But there are nights that pull you out of all that routine, nights you don't forget even after years pass. This happened to me several years ago, and I still can't fully understand what I really experienced that night. It was almost 4 a.m, and I was driving down Lake Shore Drive when I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown running barefoot down the street. She wasn't carrying a purse or anything, just that white gown clinging to her body and her hair completely disheveled. I hit the brakes almost on instinct. I didn't think about it. I just knew I had to help her. As soon as I opened the door, she jumped into the taxi with tears in her eyes, trembling uncontrollably. "Please, let's go," she said in such a broken tone that I couldn't ignore it. "Are you okay? Where should I take you?" She hugged herself and looked out the window with labored breathing. My husband is trying to kill me." My stomach dropped when I heard that. "I'm going to call the police." "Don't do it, please. He's the father of my children. I don't want to hurt them," she screamed immediately, grabbing my arm. I hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to do. Part of me said the right thing was to call 911, but the other part just wanted to get away from there as quickly as possible. "Where should I take you?" I asked again, but the woman didn't respond. She lowered her head and started crying silently, without making a single sound, just her shoulders shaking. The taxi filled with a strange tension. There was no traffic, no other cars on the street, just the sleeping city and the two of us in that vehicle. Then her phone rang. The woman jumped and pulled it out of her hospital gown with trembling hands. I saw the illuminated screen in the darkness. "Michael, husband." She started crying harder. "It's him," she whispered. I asked her to give me the phone, that I would talk to him. She shook her head several times, but finally, almost in a panic, she handed me the cell phone with shaking hands. I answered. "Where is my wife?" said a deep voice, without anger but with a certain urgency and concern. "I have her in my taxi. She asked for help because she says you hit her. I'm about to call the police." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. "You don't understand anything." His tone remained the same, without anger, but with anguish and a note of frustration. "What do you mean by that?" "My wife has schizophrenia, which causes her severe psychotic episodes. I don't know what she's told you, but you're not safe." His response left me frozen. "What are you talking about?" And then something changed, not on the phone, in the taxi. I saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman was no longer crying. She was staring at me with a wide, twisted smile. Her eyes seemed too open, without blinking, with an expression that had nothing to do with the desperation from a minute ago. She didn't look afraid at all. On the phone, the man's voice sounded urgent. "Tell her to get out, now." And then she lunged at me. I didn't see the movement coming. I just felt the weight of her body hitting me hard while her hands grabbed onto my neck. I didn't even have time to react. The taxi swayed as I tried to break free, but her strength was incredible. Her nails dug into my skin with a force that made no sense for someone so thin, and her face was so close to mine that I felt her hot, harsh breath on my face. The only thing I could do was slam on the brakes. The sound of the impact was sharp. The woman was thrown forward toward the dashboard, and her head hit the windshield with a dull thud. She remained motionless. I don't know how long it took for my breathing to return to normal. My throat hurt where her fingers had dug in. Then I heard the voice on the phone, and I immediately told him where we were, and the man simply replied that he was on his way. I don't know if I hung up or if he did, but the next thing I remember is getting out of the taxi to get away from that woman, to feel out of her reach, even though she was unconscious. It wasn't long before a car approached and parked behind the taxi. It was the husband. He got out without saying anything and approached the window. When he saw the woman, he sighed as if he were used to it. He apologized to me and said it had been a while since something like this had happened. but his teenage son had been careless and left the back patio door open when he came home from a party. I didn't know what to say. He simply thanked me and walked away, but before getting in the car, he stopped and looked at me. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, but I had to ask, What's wrong with her?" He looked at me with something resembling exhaustion. "Sometimes she disappears. And when that happens, she doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know who anyone is." I don't know what would have been worse. If he had told me she was dangerous, or if he had no idea what was really happening with her. I didn't know how to respond. He just nodded and closed the car door with her still unconscious in the backseat. I watched them drive away, leaving behind a feeling of unreality that still hasn't left me. After that, I spent days without being able to sleep well. Not just because of what happened in the taxi, but because I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, about her lost look, about the way she changed from one moment to another. I had never felt so vulnerable, so helpless inside my own car. I always thought the worst thing I could encounter on the street was a robber, maybe even something supernatural. But that night, I understood there are other dangers. Dangers you can't see coming, that don't shout or threaten, that simply smile in the rearview mirror before jumping at your throat. After that night, I became more selective about the passengers I picked up. Maybe I'll never experience something like that again, or maybe next time I won't be so lucky. But if one thing became clear to me, it's that illness and horror can wear the same face, and sometimes the most dangerous person in your cab is the one who seems to need help the most. I've been a taxi driver in Detroit for over 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the night shift could throw at me. Drunk college kids, lost tourists, the occasional domestic dispute spilling onto the street. It all became routine after a while. But what happened to me on a cold February night in 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I was working the late shift, as usual. The money was better after midnight, and I needed every dollar I could get to support my family. My dispatcher had been quiet for about an hour, so I decided to grab a late dinner from a 24-hour diner on the east side of the city. I parked outside Mel's Diner, one of those classic chrome and neon places that had been serving coffee and burgers since the 1950s. The neighborhood wasn't the best, but Mel's had survived everything Detroit had thrown at it over the decades, and their food was decent enough for the price. I was sitting in my cab, eating a cheeseburger and scrolling through my phone, when I noticed someone running toward me from across the street. It was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, and he looked absolutely terrified. His clothes were torn, his face was bruised, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if something was chasing him. He reached my taxi and started pounding on the passenger window, begging me to let him in. My first instinct was to drive away. You don't survive 15 years of night driving in Detroit by picking up random, desperate people. But something about his fear seemed genuine, and I could see fresh blood on his hands and face. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors and let him into the back seat. He immediately slumped forward, breathing heavily, and I could see he was shaking uncontrollably. "Thank you," he gasped. "Thank you so much. I didn't know where else to go." I looked around the street, expecting to see his attackers, or at least some sign of whatever had left him in this state. But the area was completely deserted. Even for this neighborhood, the silence was unusual. "What's your name, son?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and gentle. "David," he replied, though his voice sounded distant and confused. "David Morrison." "Okay, David, where do you live? I'll take you home." But David just stared at me blankly, as if the question didn't make sense. I don't remember. Everything's so foggy. I was walking and then something happened. But I can't remember what. I studied him in the rearview mirror. He had the look of someone in shock, which would explain the memory issues. His injuries appeared serious enough that he probably needed medical attention. "Do you remember your address, your phone number, anyone I can call?" David shook his head slowly. I can't think straight. Everything hurts and nothing makes sense." I made a decision. "Listen, David, I think we should get you to a hospital. You've been hurt pretty badly, and you might have a concussion." The moment I said the word hospital, David's demeanor changed completely. His eyes went wide with terror, and he started shaking his head violently. No hospitals. Please, you can't take me there. They'll. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "David, you need help. I can't just leave you like this." "No," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You don't understand. I can't go to a hospital. I can't go anywhere official. Please, just drive around for a while. Maybe I'll remember something." I didn't know what else to do. The kid was clearly traumatized, and I couldn't force him to seek medical attention if he didn't want it. So I started driving, hoping that a change of scenery might help jog his memory, or at least calm him down. We drove through the quiet streets of Detroit, past shuttered factories and abandoned lots, past the few businesses that stayed open all night. David sat in the back seat, sometimes muttering to himself in words I couldn't quite make out, sometimes falling into complete silence. After about 20 minutes, I decided to try a different approach. "David, do you remember what happened to you tonight? Who did this?" He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear him. "There were these guys. They came out of nowhere. I was just walking home from work, and they wanted my wallet, my phone. But when I gave them everything, they didn't stop. They just kept." He touched his face gingerly where the bruises were darkest. "Did you call the police?" "No." The panic was back in his voice immediately. "No police. They can't help. They never help people like me." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I didn't push. Instead, I kept driving, occasionally glancing at him in the mirror. He seemed to be getting more agitated as time went on, not less. We were stopped at a traffic light when David suddenly sat up straight, as if he'd just remembered something important. "I need to go home," he said urgently. "I need to see my mom. She'll be worried about me." "That's great, David. Do you remember your address now?" He rattled off an address on the west side of the city, in a neighborhood I knew well. It was another rough area, but at least I knew where I was going. The drive took about 15 minutes. The address he'd given me led to a small apartment building, one of those brick structures from the 1920s that had seen better days. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the few that weren't had heavy curtains drawn across them. "This is it," David said, but he made no move to get out of the car. "Are you sure you're going to be okay?" I asked. He nodded, but I could see he was still shaking. "Yeah, I'll be fine once I get inside. My mom will take care of me." He reached for the door handle, then paused. "Thank you," he said, turning to look at me directly for the first time since he'd gotten in the car. "You saved my life tonight." Before I could respond, he opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I watched him walk toward the building, expecting him to disappear through the front entrance. But he never made it to the door. One moment he was there, walking across the cracked pavement, and the next moment he simply wasn't. He didn't run, didn't hide behind a car or duck into an alley. He just vanished. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the empty sidewalk, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. I even got out of my car and walked to the exact spot where I'd last seen him, but there was no trace of David Morrison anywhere. The rational part of my mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe he'd slipped into the building so quickly that I'd missed it. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew something impossible had just happened. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the evening over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before in 15 years of cab driving. I looked up my passenger. I searched social media for David Morrison, focusing on the Detroit area. It didn't take long to find him. The first result was a news article from the Detroit Free Press, dated just 3 weeks earlier. The headline read, "Local man found dead after apparent robbery." The article described how David Morrison, age 23, had been found beaten to death in an alley not far from where I'd picked him up. Police believed he'd been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. The case remained unsolved. The photo accompanying the article showed the same young man who had sat in my back seat, begging me not to take him to a hospital, desperate to get home to his mother. I called in sick that day and spent hours trying to convince myself that I'd made a mistake, that it had been someone else, someone who just happened to look like the David Morrison in the newspaper. But the resemblance was unmistakable, and there were too many details that matched. The address he'd given me led to the apartment building where he'd lived with his mother. The injuries on his face and hands matched the description in the police report. Even his reluctance to go to a hospital or involve the police made sense now. He'd already been beyond help. I've continued driving nights, but I've never picked up another passenger like David Morrison. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, still trying to get home to his mother, still looking for someone to help him make sense of what happened to him. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've become more aware of the thin line between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. I've learned that sometimes the people who need our help the most are the ones who can no longer be helped in any conventional sense. I still work the night shift, and I still pick up passengers in rough neighborhoods. But now I know that not all of them are entirely alive. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply listen to their story and help them find their way home, even if that home is somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. David Morrison never made it inside his apartment building that night, but I like to think that our drive through the city helped him in some way, gave him a few moments of peace before he finally found whatever he was really looking for. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. Offer a safe ride through the darkness, no questions asked. I used to drive nights in Chicago back in the early 2000s, before I moved to Phoenix to be closer to my kids. Those were different times. No smartphones, no GPS, just a city map and your instincts to guide you through the urban maze after dark. I was 32 years old, unmarried, and had the energy to work until the early morning hours when the city was at its most interesting. The late-night crowd was always unpredictable. Shift workers heading home, party-goers looking for their next destination, and occasionally someone with a story that would stick with me for the rest of my life. It was a Tuesday night in November, around 2:30 in the morning, when I encountered Harold. I had just dropped off a group of college students at their dorm near Northwestern University and was heading back toward downtown when I saw him. He came running out from between two parked cars, waving his arms frantically to get my attention. At first glance, he appeared to be an elderly man, probably in his late 60s or early 70s, wearing pajamas and bedroom slippers. In the harsh glow of the streetlights, I could see that he was breathing heavily and seemed extremely agitated. Against my better judgment, "You learn to be cautious during the overnight shift," I pulled over. Something about his desperation seemed genuine, and he looked more confused than dangerous. I rolled down the passenger window. "Are you okay, sir? Do you need help?" "Please," he said, his voice shaking with urgency. "I need to get to my wife. She's calling for me, and I have to go to her right away." He climbed into the front seat without waiting for my response, which was unusual. Most passengers automatically headed for the back, but Harold seemed too distressed to follow normal social protocols. "Where does your wife live?" I asked, already reaching for my clipboard to write down the address. Harold gave me an address on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood I knew fairly well. It was about a 20-minute drive through relatively quiet streets, which suited me fine. The man seemed harmless enough, just elderly and possibly confused. As we drove, I tried to make conversation to keep him calm. "Is your wife sick? Do you need me to take you to a hospital instead?" No hospital," Harold said quickly. "She just needs me to come get her. She's been calling, and I finally heard her. I couldn't ignore her anymore." His leg was bouncing constantly, a nervous habit that reminded me of my own father when he was anxious about something. I turned up the radio slightly, hoping some soft music might help him relax, but Harold didn't seem to notice. When we reached the address he'd given me, I was surprised to see that it was the entrance to Graceland Cemetery, one of Chicago's oldest and most famous burial grounds. The wrought iron gates were imposing even in the darkness, and beyond them, I could see rows of monuments and mausoleums stretching into the shadows. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion," I said gently. "This is a cemetery." "I know exactly where I am," Harold replied, his voice suddenly more focused than it had been during the entire ride. "Please wait for me. I'll be right back." Before I could protest, he was out of the taxi and walking toward the entrance. To my amazement, the night watchman, a man I could barely make out in the darkness, opened the gate and let Harold inside without any apparent hesitation. I sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. My dispatcher would probably send someone to check on me if I didn't report in soon, but I felt responsible for Harold's safety. He was clearly not thinking clearly, and I couldn't just abandon him at a cemetery in the middle of the night. Finally, I got out of my car and walked over to the gate. The watchman was an elderly African-American man with kind eyes and a thermos of coffee in his hands. "Excuse me," I said. "The man who just went in there, do you know him?" The watchman nodded slowly, That's Harold. He comes here about once a week, always around this time of night. Says his wife calls to him and he has to come see her. His wife is buried here. Been here about 2 years now. Harold, he's not quite right since she passed. Lives alone in one of those senior buildings downtown, but sometimes he gets confused at night and thinks she's still alive, thinks she needs him to come get her. The watchman took a sip of his coffee and gestured toward the cemetery. Normally, I wouldn't let anyone in after hours, but Harold's harmless. He just sits by her grave for a few minutes, talks to her, then he's ready to go home. I figure it's better to let him have his peace than to turn him away and have him try to climb the fence. Does he have family? Someone who should know he's wandering around at night? Not that I know of. I asked him about that once, but he got real upset, said his wife was his only family. I think that's part of the problem. He's got nobody left but her memory. I understood now why Harold had seemed so desperate, so focused on reaching his destination. In his mind, his wife was still alive somewhere, still needed him. The grief and loneliness had created a reality where death was just a temporary separation. How long does he usually stay? I asked. Never more than 10 or 15 minutes. He'll be back soon. I thanked the watchman and returned to my taxi to wait. True to his prediction, Harold emerged from the cemetery about 12 minutes later. But he was a completely different person than the man who had gone in. Where before he had been agitated and desperate, now he seemed calm and content. There was even a slight smile on his face as he walked back to my car. When he got in, this time in the back seat, his whole demeanor had changed. "Thank you for waiting," he said politely. "I'm ready to go home now." He gave me a different address this time, one that led to a senior living complex in a better part of town. As we drove, Harold sat quietly, occasionally murmuring things I couldn't quite make out, as if he was having a quiet conversation with someone. "How was your visit?" I asked, not sure if I should acknowledge what had just happened. "Oh, it was wonderful," Harold said, his voice warm with happiness. "She looks so beautiful tonight. She told me about her day, and I told her about mine. She's doing very well, very well indeed." I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt a chill run down my spine. Harold was looking at the empty seat beside him and nodding, as if responding to something someone had said. His eyes were focused on a specific point in the back seat, tracking movements I couldn't see. "She's riding with us, isn't she?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Of course she is," Harold said matter-of-factly. "She always comes home with me after our visits. Sometimes she stays for a few days before she has to go back." The rest of the drive passed in relative silence, except for Harold's occasional quiet comments to his invisible companion. Things like, "Yes, dear, I remembered to take my medicine," and "The weather has been quite nice lately, hasn't it?" When we reached the senior complex, Harold got out of the taxi, but left the door open for several seconds longer than necessary, as if waiting for someone else to exit. Finally, he closed the door and walked around to my window. "Thank you so much for your help tonight," he said, pressing money into my hand, more than enough to cover the fare and a generous tip. "You've been very kind to both of us." He walked toward the building entrance, occasionally pausing as if to allow someone to catch up with him. At the front door, he held it open longer than needed, then disappeared inside. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what I had just experienced. The rational part of my mind said that Harold was a lonely old man dealing with grief and possibly some form of dementia. But another part of me, a part I didn't usually listen to, wondered if there might be more to the story. As I started to drive away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror that made my blood freeze. For just a moment, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a woman sitting in my back seat, her pale face turned toward the window, watching Harold disappear into his building. I slammed on the brakes and spun around to look, but the back seat was empty. Just the worn vinyl upholstery and the faint scent of lavender that I hadn't noticed before. I drove home that night with all my windows down, despite the November cold. The lavender smell seemed to linger no matter how much fresh air I let into the car, and I kept checking my mirrors to make sure I was truly alone. The next morning, I called the senior living complex to check on Harold, telling them I was a taxi driver who had given him a ride and wanted to make sure he'd gotten home safely. The woman on the phone was very kind and assured me that Mr. Harold Brennan was fine, though she mentioned that he had these episodes fairly regularly. He was married to his wife Alina for 47 years, she explained. When she passed away, it just broke something inside him. The doctors say it's a combination of grief and early-stage dementia. Some nights he gets confused and thinks she's still alive, thinks she needs him to come get her from somewhere. Does he always go to the cemetery? Usually, yes. We've tried to stop him, but he gets so agitated that it seems cruel. The night watchman there is very understanding, and Harold always comes back home safely. We figure it's better to let him have this connection with her memory than to force him to stay locked up here. I drove nights for 3 more years after that, but I never saw Harold again. Sometimes I would drive past Graceland Cemetery and wonder if he was in there, having his weekly visit with Alina. I hoped that their reunions brought him peace, even if they existed only in his mind. But I couldn't shake the memory of that woman's reflection in my mirror, couldn't explain away the scent of lavender that had filled my car. Maybe love really is stronger than death. Maybe some bonds are so deep that they transcend the boundaries between life and whatever comes after. I moved to Phoenix in 2006, but I still think about Harold and Alina sometimes, especially when I drive past cemeteries at night. I like to imagine that they're together now, that Harold no longer has to take midnight taxi rides to visit her, that they're both at peace in whatever comes after this life. Some stories don't have clear endings, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. All I know for certain is that love can take many forms, and sometimes the most powerful connections between people are the ones that refuse to be broken, even by death itself. The human heart is capable of creating its own reality when the truth becomes too painful to bear. And maybe that's not always a bad thing. Maybe Harold's midnight visits were exactly what both he and Alina needed, whether she was truly there, or just a beautiful illusion born from decades of devotion. Either way, I was honored to be part of their story, even if I never fully understood it. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.